Hello and welcome all to today's webinar, which is top tips to help Brits retire successfully in Australia. So today we're just going to run through a few slides and I'll introduce you to our speakers for today. So before I do start, I'm just going to have to just run through just one or two like T's and C's. So some of the information you'll be provided to today is information. Please don't take it as advice. If you want any further kind of information or any advice, please speak to one of the speakers after the events, details of which you will be provided with. So first of all, today's presenters, it's myself, Paul Davis. I'm Financial Planning Manager here in the UK. I'm the co-founder of bdhSterling and I've got 30 years experience in the UK financial services. Joining me today from bdhSterling is John Harrower, who's a senior financial planner in Australia, very well qualified and experienced with dealing with expats or people relocating from the UK to Australia. In fact, he is someone who's done that journey himself, so very experienced both from professionally and personally. And we are really lucky today that we've been joined by Melissa from Journey, who some of you might know already, and she will be talking through some of the relocation aspects of moving from the UK to Australia. So, yeah, welcome, Melissa. So first of all, just a brief introduction to what we're going to run through today. So, as you know, Australia is always a popular destination for emigrating Brits. You know, traditionally, we're not a very good country at learning new languages. So Australia, who more or less speak English, is obviously a very popular destination for people to go to. And currently, there's over 1 million Brits in Australia, so anyone moving across will be in good company. And talking through today, as I said before, Melissa will be running through the relocation part, and it will be myself and John that will be looking at more of the financial steps you need and to consider before moving across to Australia. So I'm going to hand you over to our guest speaker straight away. So Melissa, please, if you would continue, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction so much. Hello, everyone, and it's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me. As Paul said, my name is Melissa, and I'm the founder and director of Journey Relocations, and we are based in sunny Perth in Western Australia. When we're talking with clients about relocating and retiring or nearing retirement in Australia, there's a couple of top tips that we do like to talk about to help them create that successful transition and that soft landing in Australia. And the first one is definitely considering which capital city, or it might be regional or rural town that they're going to settle in. And for some people, they have made that decision already, or it's an easy decision. But for many others, they're really unsure and there's lots of choice there. So it's sort of stating the obvious, but your lifestyle preferences will come into play there. If you're a sun-loving, hot weather, water-based person, then you know your Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast and Perth will be the perfect fit. But if you are not a lover of the hot weather, you might prefer more the arts, the culture, the shopping and your iconic sporting events, then certainly Melbourne would be a better fit. So getting some consideration to that. Also, the geographical location of the cities, it's well known and talked about that Perth is considered one of the most isolated cities in the world, whereas your cities on the East Coast, certainly for commuting and visiting between Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, for example, is much more accessible and much easier. And then lastly, it is also considering the cost of living, and rent plays a factor in that, which I'll touch on. But recent figures published by CoreLogic, for example, when we talk about rental prices. To give you an idea, Sydney median house prices, so houses, not apartments, but houses, Sydney's running at about 620 Australian dollars weekly rent, as opposed to Perth, that's 490. Now, those figures are changing. They're quite dynamic at the moment, but that gives you an idea of the prices. So once you've decided on your city or area, then you do need to have a thought about the suburb or the locale within that city. And again, your type of property preference will influence that somewhat. So, you know, if you really want an apartment with a balcony and a view and that communal co-sharing living, then that apartment living is going to be perfect. But if you would prefer a suburban home, maybe with a pool or maybe with a garden, then you will be unlikely to find that right in that inner city. So giving some thought to the type of property that you want is really important. And hand in hand with that, we often ask our clients to give some thought to what is your anchor? What is that sort of stake in the ground, driving force, tying you to a location? For some, it's coming out because they're coming out to visit adult children who have already made the move. Some are moving out and joining friends who've already made the move. Some might be, even though they're nearing retirement, they still may want to do some part-time paid employment or contracting. So is commuting of relevance to you? So it's worthwhile bearing those factors in mind too. Once you've chosen your city and your suburb, then the third part of that jigsaw puzzle is finding your best fit home. And for a lot of clients that we speak to, for that first 12 to 24 months, it often is renting before they reach that midterm goal of purchasing an asset and buying or building a home. And we all know that the rental market across Australia is very challenging at the moment and will continue to be for some time. So we spend a lot of time guiding clients on becoming a successful applicant and tenant. And my top tips for that would be, make sure you put the time and the effort into your rental application. It is a really stringent process followed in Australia. So your normal identifications, your normal proof of savings, your normal references, character references, personal references, professional references. It is really worth pulling that all together for a very strong application. It does help to be flexible and a little realistic. So by all means, set a wish list and you might have 10 criteria on there. It's likely you might tick 6 or 7 of those boxes, but in the current market, it is rather unlikely that you'll get the full 10. Just to give an idea of the availability of stocks at the moment across Australia, recent figures published by SQM Research, Sydney is running at a 1.7% vacancy rate, Melbourne's running similar, 1.6%, and Perth is running at 0.6%. Very, very little stock around, and nationally, I think we're averaging around 1%. So being open-minded and flexible on your first rental home, which might be a bit of a transition home, really does help. And lastly on that, just make sure you do allow enough time that does deliver the best outcomes. And we certainly find that if we have to fast track the rental application process through, it can be a little challenging. So once you've got your capital city and your suburb and your home, those first 3 parts sorted, then it's really important that you start to focus a little more on you. So you've arrived, and now that health and well-being for me is about building those connections and community. And that really is important to keep that homesickness at bay, to find your like-minded people, to find your tribe. And for everyone, that is different. Some people want a higher level of contact with their communities and some less so. So what that really means is setting some goals about what you want this next chapter in your life to look like. And that might mean, is it volunteering? And does that mean, is it once a week, once a month, once a year? And what type of organisation? Volunteering with children, volunteering with adults, volunteering in a food-based environment. And I guess what's really going to give you joy in this part of your retirement years where you've got the time and the freedom and the flexibility to give back. So I think it is worthwhile taking the time to understand what it is that you want in this next chapter. And then there's really easy ways to do that moving forward. And the last bit, when you have arrived in Australia, and particularly with the UK, where we've got reciprocal health rights in place with UK residents, so you do have access to Medicare, which is our public health system, but hand in hand with that, it is very common in Australia to also take out private health insurance, and that covers more your ancillary services not covered by Medicare. So that would be, for example, dental, optical, physio, chiro. So if those types of health services are important to you in your lifestyle, make sure you do look into private health soon after arriving. And also know that your mental health is just as important, and there are lots of support services, and many of them free and subsidised by the government, that you can also access once you are here. And then just lastly, I guess the last tip that we always like to give clients is please make sure you do take time to stop and have a little break or a holiday. It doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be expensive, but relocating and heading for retirement is a real emotional journey, and it is stressful, and it's a massive journey. So when you can, when time allows, whichever capital city you find yourself in Australia, we are well known for our holiday destinations, whatever that means to you. And it's a really nice way to complete that transition once you have moved out from the UK. So that's it from me, Paul.
Right, thanks very much for that, Melissa. As I said, we are available for just questions and answers after this. So if there's anything you want to ask Melissa, please obviously sort of drop into the box, but also we'll provide details of all the speakers at the end of this. So if you want to speak separately, we will do that. So yeah, thanks very much for that, Melissa. So on to some of the kind of practical financial aspects of this. So some of the things that you will be needing to think about, first of all, is having enough and how long your money will need to last. So currently a male aged 65 is expected to live on average another 20 years, a woman aged 65 over 22 years on average. Hopefully a move to the sunshine of Australia will extend that a little bit more, but it is a complex decision, and there are a few things to consider about finances. So it might not even be that you look for your money to last during your own lifetime. So the question might be, are you looking to leave a legacy for your kids or whoever beyond your lifetime? And another thing to consider is holding your money in a location where it will last for you. So it could be that you're holding money in UK pensions, or maybe that you're looking to hold your funds in an Australian super. But there are many considerations for kind of long-term retirement planning. So I'll come on to some of those considerations in a moment, and obviously that's something that bdhSterling can provide advice on. So repaying your mortgage. So yeah, historically a normal pathway to pay off for retirement, and I think for those of you who are watching this seminar from the UK, you'll realise that our interest rates have been, well, are increasing and potentially will increase again in November. So it's something to kind of think about with your mortgaging or remortgaging or looking to sell off your property. So if you are moving to the UK, from the UK to Australia, there are a couple of things to have a think about, and often either by design or default, people do retain a property in the UK when they do move across to Australia. So there's a few things to think about when people are doing that, whether it's a residential property or whatever it might be, a legacy of their main residence they can't sell, or maybe investment properties that are held in the UK. There's three things to think about, and I always put it in kind of the short, medium and long term. So in the short term, if you are receiving rental income and you're resident in Australia, one of the things to think about as a non-resident landlord in the UK is income tax and how that's taxed. In the sort of medium term, you've got capital gains tax when you finally do sell a UK property as a resident in Australia, and how that is treated for tax in one regime or the other. Is there a better regime, either the Australian tax regime or a UK tax regime for that to fall in, particularly for those who have investment properties? Do you sell before you go, or do you retain whilst you are resident in Australia? And finally, in the more long term, one of the things to consider is inheritance tax. So if you are a resident of Australia and you're deemed to be domiciled in Australia, you don't pay inheritance tax in Australia. That's just one of the advantages of being in Australia. But retaining property or certain assets in the UK could still keep you under the UK inheritance tax net. So they're the three key things to think about with regards to property and whether to retain in the UK or sell. Of course, you might just need to sell your main residence to start your new life in Australia, but quite often, or in some cases, that doesn't work out as smooth as you would hope. So another thing to consider, other than obviously the bottom here is like a buy-to-let property, which I've just touched on, but there are other potential sources of income in the UK and Australia that you would need to think about, both when you move over and maybe in retirement. So pensions, which could be both personal arrangements, company pensions or state pensions. People would have accrued them in the UK before moving across to Australia, and there's a question of how they would be treated for tax, or whether you retain them in the UK or transfer or roll over into Australia. Would that be more tax beneficial? One consideration is that if you are at preservation age 60 in Australia and you're taking money out of an Australian super, the equivalent of a UK pension, that's taken out tax-free, whereas a permanent resident in the UK, a permanent resident from the UK moving to Australia, there will be different tax implications for income paid across. Savings and investments, ISAs, I'm going to come on to ISAs in another slide in a moment, just give you an example of that. But yeah, that's a potential source of income that's moved off. And there's obviously things like stocks, shares and bonds, which could be onshore or offshore. So they're the kind of financial assets that someone would hold. That the tax treatment in the UK might be different when you consider your Australian residency. So moving assets from the UK to Australia, as I say, there's two different types of tax regimes. And movement of disposal of the asset you might have in the UK, depending on what it is, might be beneficial to do so before you move, or it might be beneficial to retain as an Australian resident. But one way or the other, if you don't get that right, you could expose yourself to unnecessary taxes. So a couple of things to think about is the type of asset and the timing of disposing or repackaging that asset. So just to give you an example, I spoke to a new inquiry to bdhSterling only last week, and they had a conversation with me that before they were moving to Australia, they had read that the assets within an ISA, or the growth income potential from a UK ISA, would be taxable once they become resident in Australia. Now that is partly true. So ISAs don't exist in Australia, therefore the Australian Tax Office don't recognise them, and you could get taxed on the income and gains, and that could also be not only in terms of the income and gains from the investments, but any changes in the exchange rate that moves in the individual's favour. So decided, okay, that's before I go to Australia, let's dissolve this. But the reality was he was going to Australia initially on a bridging or sort of temporary provisional visa. And there are actually some benefits you can have from any period you spend as a temporary or provisional visa holder in Australia. And that includes any foreign income, assets or gains aren't taxed by Australia. So in reality, whilst he was on that, he could hold the ISA in a tax-free environment. So there are a few little things and nuances between the two systems that you need to be aware of. And it's about asking the right questions or understanding what you can and can't do. And that's where bdhSterling are there to help. So I am going to hand over now to John Harrower, who's going to talk a little bit now about arriving in Australia and some of the financial aspects that you need to consider.
Thanks, Paul. Both speakers have brought in two very important things, and it's all about making sure that you seek advice prior to coming to Australia, making sure that you get the assistance to move here from a permanent point of view, and importantly, giving yourself time to settle down personally before really looking at financial advice in Australia. And once you have settled into where you are living, part of the things that a financial planner in Australia will immediately be looking at is, and it doesn't really matter what age, but obviously working out what sort of income is comfortable for you in Australia, not only now, but in future retirement. And we do that by regular meetings for budgeting, etc., like that. Planning short and medium term planned expenses. So, if we're considering buying cars or doing further travel, we need to assess that and plan for the future. And then we've got to take into account, taxation in Australia is obviously different to the UK, and we look at strategies to actually put any sort of future investing, superannuation in the best tax effective environment, all focusing towards a retirement goal, which should include what income you think you're going to be comfortable with in retirement, and those strategies working towards that retirement age. And as previous slides have talked about, assisting with debt reduction and looking at personal insurances, etc., to get to your retirement. Cool. So retirement is an ever-evolving age. We all think that 65 is, yes, we're going to work till 65. This day and age, a lot of people are working towards younger ages, and on the government side, they're all basically putting the retirement age to access government pensions higher. So it's an ever-evolving place where strategies have to be put in place to meet the goals of what age you would like to retire and what impacts they will be. So it's not really a single event of working full-time right up till retirement. There's considerations, especially in Australia, as Paul's mentioned, with reaching the age of 60, that we also have transition to retirement, where some parts of your retirement entitlements in Australia can be accessed in a tax-free environment to assist reducing your hours of work or potentially retiring early. The one thing that we've got to consider too is obviously moving to Australia, becoming a permanent resident in Australia. If you are going to, at some stage, commence a UK state pension, the actual pension is what we call crystallised. So whatever you are entitled to, for instance, if it's the full UK state pension, I believe it's around about that £195 a week. If it's in Australia and you're living here, it will be crystallised at £195 for the rest of your life per week. It won't be indexed. The other thing to consider too is when you move to Australia and you are close to retirement, that there may not be any Australian government assistance from a pension point of view in the first 10 years that you are a permanent resident. But after that, you will become eligible to apply potentially for some assistance in Australia. The difference between the two is obviously that in the UK, you pay a national insurance contribution, and it's dependent on how many years of contributions that you put in is how much you qualify for a particular pension from the UK, as opposed to Australia, where we basically have an asset test and an income test. And whichever is the worst test for you is how much you actually are eligible to receive in pension. The other thing to potentially think about, and it's quite important, is obviously coming to Australia and considering that you might be 35 and moving to Australia. We've still got 25 years before we're even considering retirement. We might be bringing a family across. There's initial debt that may be having to take on to buy a house, car, etc. So it's always very important to seek advice around protecting not only your spouse and your family, but protecting your wealth as well. So like I mentioned before, we have to consider insurance to cover you and make sure that if God forbid anything to happen, that we have things in place that's going to protect those family members. Inheritance is also a very crucial part of any sort of retirement plan. We all should know how important a will can be, but specifically in Australia, without a will, it's basically going to the public trustees in Australia, who will then determine who the beneficiaries are, and the cost of a public trustee to determine that is quite a high fee. It can be up to 4% of your estate. So having a will in place, nominating executors, and making sure that your beneficiaries that you want to have that legacy handed down to is in place. In addition to that, we've also got to look at, if there's events such as I don't die, but I lose mental capacity, that we have enduring power of attorneys in place for both spouses, and obviously having some sort of substitute in case that either one of those enduring power of attorneys cannot make decisions for themselves. So the most important thing in any consideration of moving to Australia is it is going to be stressful. The excitement of moving to a new country, especially with these magnificent beaches that we have that we try not to tell anybody about, but it can be a stressful journey. That comes from winding up some of your financial affairs in the UK, jumping on that 17-hour flight to Perth or longer if you're going to the eastern states, landing in a country where bank accounts have got to be open, tax file numbers have got to be applied for, not knowing your way around. It can be very stressful, and that's where Journey comes into play to hold your hand through that process, along with financial planners once you've got settled in, and we can actually take you through those webs of different events that can happen in your life and make sure that you are protected, you're not overly paying in tax, and we're trying to achieve the ultimate in a retirement goal. So planning or having an association with a financial planner, having regular reviews, making sure that we're on track with your goals and objectives. And surprisingly, goals and objectives can change as life goes on. So, you know, what you thought today might be totally different in 5 years' time. And it's really important that there is that communication or partnership with a financial planner that can actually take that journey and make sure they've got strategies in place that can bend and weave to the different goals that change in life. And obviously maximising any sort of tax that's being paid from available income that's coming through, whether it's now where you're working or ultimately when you're retired. There are some emotional challenges, and you know, as I said, from a financial planner's point of view, we should be able to hold your hand and challenge not only yourself, but look outside the box to make sure that we get there in the end. So retiring in a different country is another thing as well. And one of the biggest experiences I've had for people moving to the UK is leaving family and friends behind. And as we get closer to retirement and we get a bit older, we get a bit sentimental, and we want to be with our friends and family as we do the age increase. And it's important to understand that if you have made that decision to stay permanently in Australia, that we cater for and travel back to see those families and friends on a regular basis. And it's quite important that that's included in the strategy. And obviously, the advice and support that we do in every stage of that journey to retirement is the trust and the informed decisions that you can make along the way that your advisor should be able to provide for you. Financial planning support, it's emotional impact for stop working. So we can think about all the figures in the world about retiring, and a good financial planner not only should be catering to meet your income requirements, but also be challenging you on what you're going to do. It's like, you know, you've had a mortgage all your life and suddenly that mortgage is gone. One of the questions I get is, well, what do I do with the money I've got left over now? Because they start panicking. They're used to paying a bill. It's the same with working. You know, we've got to plan for retirement from a lifestyle point of view and think about that we're not going to sit in front of a television and watch golf all day. So it's important to build an ongoing relationship with financial planners and other professionals along the way so that we can cater and bend to your future plan, which won't just be a single plan. It will change over time.
Okay, thanks, John. So just to just a few points. Okay, so why bdhSterling? So obviously we offer a wealth of experience. We've got offices in both the UK and Australia. So I mean, I'm speaking to you from our UK office in Epsom. John there's been speaking to you from our one of our Australian offices in Perth. We understand the complexity and potential pitfalls. We're uniquely placed to support in retirement planning. And we can offer a genuine one-stop shop if you're retiring in Australia, particularly if you've started your journey here and you've built up some of your retirement, or maybe even started your retirement here in the UK and you're transitioning across to Australia. And journey, well, as Melissa has touched on, their relocation and lifestyle management, and as promised, the details of Melissa and how to get in touch with Melissa are on this slide, and all these slides will be available. And so, any questions? So I've just gone into the questions box. There's a couple of questions there, so I will I'll read them out and I can answer some of those. So first of all, is a will made in UK still valid if you're residing in Australia? So the answer to that is yes, it is. But what we would always recommend, particularly if you are going to have assets both in the UK and Australia, is to have a will in both countries. And it's very important as to some of the things you put in the will as well. So as I said, you could have assets in both countries, you could have beneficiaries in both countries. So it's important that the will is recognised by both jurisdictions. So and one or two things to think about as well, or a very big thing to think about, is that Australia doesn't have inheritance tax and the UK does. So it is quite important that you make sure that eventually you are deemed to be what's known as domiciled in Australia rather than the UK for inheritance tax purposes, because it will be a little bit kinder to your estate in that respect. And included in the will would be just, would be a step towards being deemed domiciled in Australia, would be, putting in something like, you wish to be buried in Australia, because that would demonstrate that that's where you determine your home, whether it's buried or cremated, however you will be disposed of eventually. But the point is, that's any indication that Australia is your home, that's something you need to put in your will. Second question that's come up, can you continue to draw your UK state pension whilst in Australia? Well, John did touch on this, so the answer to it is yes, and you would still be withdrawing your UK state pension whilst in Australia. It can be paid into UK bank account, could be paid across into an Australian bank account. But one of the key points, and John did touch on this, is once you become an Australian resident, then you are no longer entitled to escalation on that UK pension. So it'll be paid, but you won't get the indexation increases. It doesn't seem very fair, but there was a social security agreement up to about 2003 between the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, all kind of the ex-Commonwealth countries, where they did uprate each other's state pensions in payment, but that agreement collapsed in 2003. So as a result, if someone is in Australia receiving a UK state pension, it doesn't get indexed anymore, but you can still have it paid to you. Next question I've got is, can we retire from the UK to Australia in our early 50s? And if so, would we be eligible, even after a few years, to do a little bit of paid work in Australia? So I can answer to part of that question, and yes, you can retire from the UK to Australia, but it would kind of depend on your visa type as to whether you're required to work or not required to work. So I don't know how far. Maybe we can have the person asking that question could separately let us know what type of visa they've applied for or they are going on, because there's certain kind of conditions. But yes, you can. Obviously, yes, you can retire in Australia, and if you can afford to, you can retire earlier than 60, but accessing your super might be a little bit more complicated. I don't know, John, if you could just maybe step in and maybe speak about someone who wants to take their benefits from an Australian pension before.
Yeah, so it's important to think that if you're retiring in your early 50s, it's certainly, yes, you definitely can retire early, and yes, you could. It would have to be using your own personal funds, because such things as government support and access to superannuation and pensions have an age which is primarily starting 60 for private superannuation and pensions, but also then you've got UK state and age pension in Australia not being eligible till 67. So it is possible, but again, it'd be seeking that advice to see if it's doable, if you know what I mean.
Thanks, John. So just kind of go through some of these questions while people are still on. We've got a few more. So first of all, what does your financial advice cost? So it would all depend on what kind of service you're going through us, but what would happen would we would declare any costs and charges that you would likely to occur before you engage with us. So how we work, we'll do an initial meeting or assessment that we don't charge for, with no obligation to go ahead, where we will assess your situation, and during that we will run through your costs and services, because no two people are the same, and people do require different services from us at different levels. So I think it's probably best for, you know, make an appointment on an individual basis, and we can then just run through our costs and services that would apply to you. Another question: if you retire to Australia but then return to the UK later, does your UK state pension start to be indexed again on return, or not at all? So when you move back to the UK, yeah, your state pension, if you move back to the UK, your state pension will start to index once again. Would a UK teacher's pension still be index linked? I presume that question is related to if you receiving a UK teacher's pension and you are resident in Australia. The answer to that is yes. The difference between a state pension and a teacher's pension, or maybe a UK civil service pension, or any type of index linked final salary scheme, is that is kind of the scheme rules, whereas state pension is just government rules. So the teacher's pension would still be index linked. And next question, probably a difficult question, but what sort of pension pot do people take into retirement on average? For example, is 1.5 million Aus dollars a lot, little, etc.? Well, look, that depends on your lifestyle. It will depend on what your kind of expenses and aspirations are in retirement. It might be a lot, and it might not be enough. It depends on what an individual is looking to do. And I think at the very top of this presentation, we were talking about longevity and how much it lasts, and thinking about the kind of the average mortality rates of an individual. I mean, again, there's so many factors to consider, and that's where the important part of financial planning comes in, because we can look at your situation, put together some kind of cash flow forecasting, and we can see, based on your objectives, income, expenses, how long we think that your money would last. At what point could I purchase a house in Australia? Can I do this before the official move, or do I have to wait until I arrive? So I don't know if Melissa, you can maybe have a think about whether you can actually do that, or whether it's a good idea to.
From a tax implication, obviously that's not my area, but from a most people prefer to just really understand the suburb and the location that they're in before putting those roots down. And I think a lot of people, until they need to see homes in real life to understand their size and scale and block sizes and commutes and that. So, I mean, yes, it would be possible with a buyer's advocate, with authority, but it's not what I see as common, I guess.
Thanks for that, Melissa. And we've got I've got a question which is I think I would probably defer to our we have a separate arm to our business, BDH Tax, and I will probably defer to that, and I can answer a separate question. But it's, what are the rules for a temporary resident visa holders purchasing property for themselves to reside in? As I understand, and I'm not an expert on this, it would have to be a new build, but I will I'll defer that question and pick up on that later. So going through some of these, I'm British, but my husband is Italian. Does that affect anything? Well, I think how that affects people, I mean, I don't know what we're thinking about, whether in terms of applying for a visa or maybe from an inheritance tax point of view. But if an individual, for a couple, from an inheritance tax point of view, if a couple, one is UK domiciled and one isn't considered a UK domicile, then there are slightly different tax rules on that. But hopefully, the longer someone spends in Australia, they'll be in a position to break the UK domicile, and you won't have to worry about that. If I join my UK company pension in Australia, would that be taxed Aus tax rate or non-resident tax rate? It will depend on your visa status. If you are a permanent resident of Australia, then the taxing rights of UK pension income coming from the UK will be in Australia. If you're on a temporary or provisional visa, then that will defer to the UK. But again, I think you need to take very much individual tax advice or kind of financial planning advice on that. If you have dual passports, can you pay into both UK and Australian pensions, superannuations, and draw benefits of both? Well, if you're a UK tax resident, then you have more scope to contribute to a UK pension than if you're a UK non-tax resident. I think the visa or the passport holder isn't the issue here. It's where you are actually tax resident. The benefit of contributing to a UK pension over an Australian super is that UK pension, you will get tax relief at source. Australian super contributions you will not, but there is the benefit that Aussie super you can actually take out at retirement, preservation age 60, you can take out tax free. So there are a couple of things to think about. Again, that's an advice piece that we would need to look at, but there's just a couple of considerations. Is it possible to live successfully as a dual resident, e.g. 6 months UK, 6 months Oz? It is possible, but I would take, and we, as I said, we've got UK and Australian based chartered accountancy firm BDH Tax that works with us, that would be able to talk to you about like this, what would be known as the split residency, and whether it is best to have your tax situation in one country or another, because it might reduce it or it might increase it depending on your circumstances and where some of your incomes and assets are sourced. Okay, so I'm really apologise if I'm skipping through some of these. We've got a lot more questions than I thought, and the and our webinar is actually due or overdue to finish now. So I'm going to maybe throw this one open to my colleagues in Australia. On average, what would monthly bills cost for a retired couple in Australia, i.e. gas, electric, and rates? I don't know which one of you guys want to jump in.
I could probably answer that. So a lot less than the UK at the moment, if that's a good answer. But realistically, a comfortable income in retirement for the average retiree in Australia is around about that, somewhere between $55,000 and $60,000. So if we're breaking that down, it's about $1,100 a week, and that should cover most utilities, food expenses, a little bit of social, and potentially some savings out of that.
Okay.
Did you want to add anything else, Melissa? Or?
All good.
All good.
Okay. Okay, so I am going to have to kind of wrap up, I'm afraid, the webinar today, and I do apologise. I have several people who have still questions that are still in our question and answer session. But if you'd like to email me at Paul Davis, so my email address pdavis@bdhSterling.com, I can source the question and maybe put it out to my colleagues who'll be able to help. So apologies that we didn't get round to doing all the questions today, but all I'd like to say is, like, thank you so much for attending. We do like putting on a lot of these types of webinars, and they only really work with participation and attendance from people who are listening in or watching these types of webinars. So thank you so much for attending. Thanks very much from Melissa from Journeys for being our guest speaker today. Really do appreciate that. It obviously gives our webinars a different angle and a different flavour to them. So thank you very much, Melissa. And I hope that you all have a good rest of the day. So thank you so much. As I say, apologies that we couldn't get round to all the questions, but if you'd like to, I'll pick them up from this webinar, and or if you'd like to just drop me an email, as I said, pdavies@bdhsterling.com, we'll be able to help you. Okay, so thank you very much for today.
Thank you.